Hello everyone. I wanted to give you guys a quick look at Capture One Pro 10 for anyone who hasn't used the program before. Not just to get familiar with the program, but also to see some of the tools that it has in order for you to take the raw file that we've provided for this contest and make the most out of it as possible. Now, this is a post-processing contest, so I recommend getting started with Capture One Pro 10 in terms of color toning and color grading and bringing out the most detail as possible in the raw file before going in and retouching in Photoshop and other things like that. So first and foremost, what's going to happen is once you launch Capture One Pro 10, the first thing you need to do is make a catalog. The place to make a catalog is under File, New Catalog, and naming your specific catalog and where you want to place it. So we can name it anything we want. I'll go and call it Testing 3, as I was doing some tests earlier. Now once we've made the catalog, you'll see the name in the corner. But also, we'll go ahead and hit Import Images. You can also go in over here and hit Import Images over here as well. So I'll hit Import Images. I'll pick the location that I want to use. In this instance, I've picked my download folder, and we'll pick the image we're going to use. This image is by Bella Konak, and she gave us this image from one of her recent shoots that she did with the Phase 1 XF 100 megapixel camera. Now, by default, you should see that you have the information here. She shot this all natural light, and these are her settings. Next, we'll go over here to our tabs. This first tab here is just your library. Once you've imported this into the catalog, and if you don't see it, make sure you click on either All Images or under Recent Imports. Let's go on to Processing. One of the first tabs that we're going to pick is the Color tab. Now in the Color tab itself, this is the area where we can adjust our white balance. We can adjust our tint. We can also adjust a varied array of areas such as your shadows, midtones, and highlights in a way that does it by the color wheel. So say we want to adjust our shadows and add a bluer tint, and then in our midtones we can adjust more colors here and add more of a red tint here. We can also adjust the luminosity on the right with this tab here, as well as the highlights, in case you want to bring up the intensity of the highlights. Now, if you feel like you want to undo this, all you need to do is simply click on this arrow, and it's going to undo all the settings we did in our color balance area. Same thing goes for a white balance. We can undo that as well. So that's one tool to play with in terms of color toning your image. Next, we also have a color editor here. Now if you don't see any of these tabs, should you have already used Capture One before, please note that you can also modify them by taking them out and also going over to a new tab and placing it there. So it gives you a whole range of customization when it comes to modifying the location of your tools, which is really nice, and the order in which you can place them as well. So aside from your color balance, which also has a saturation in case you want to add a color to a specific area, but also just change the intensity in which the color is being applied to the area, you can do it here manually. We also have a black and white tab in case you want to do black and whites. Next, over here on our, this area here, we have our exposure, but also we have different things like levels and curves that we can play with. For example, on our curves, instead of just using RGB, which can adjust our exposure based on different regions. So if you've used Photoshop before, you know exactly how curves work. Over here we see our histogram. Now on the right hand side shows the range in which our highlights are. So in case we want to adjust the highlights, we'll simply click on the curve that represents this vertical column and then bring it up, and you notice that the highlights on the dress are gone up. But similarly, if we go into, say, Luma, this is just for luminosity without affecting saturation of the colors. Also, we have our red, green, and blue channel. So say we want to add a cross-process look, we can take a couple of points here, one in our highlights and one in our shadows, and we can adjust it accordingly. So if we bring up the blues, you can see that the shadows are a lot darker in terms of how blue they are, I should say. And in our highlights, we can pull it down to add more yellow, or pull it up to add a colder feel to it. And we can just drag it down and pick the points off if we need to, or hit backspace and it deletes that point as well. Same thing goes for our other areas here, where you can see that the curve, bringing it down, adds more magenta across the image, and going up adds more green. Same thing for reds. If we bring it down, it takes away the red. Bring it up, it adds more reds into the highlights. And you can add as many points as you want and get a really distinct cross-processed look. The benefit of doing most of your color work in the Capture One stage is, because this is a raw file, specifically shot with the Phase 1, being able to bring out that information is only possible in the raw processing stage. After that, once it's processed and you bring it to Photoshop and do any color tweaks after that, the leverage isn't as strong, and you're not getting that raw data anymore, which is why I always recommend processing it in the raw stage primarily, if at all possible. Now, aside from those, we also have our levels. Levels I don't use as much, just because curves has such flexibility, but levels can be used as a form of layering. So in case you like everything here and you want to tweak just a few of the levels in terms of how deep and rich the shadows and highlights are, you can do it there as well. And the same thing goes for the channels here. So if I pull the blues in over here, you can see it's adding more blues into the highlights because it's compressing the information. On the left hand side, if I do that accordingly, it's going to take away some of the blues and the shadows. So going left adds more blue, going right takes it away in essence. But the opposite happens on the top. So your input level, which means basically that if I go right, you can see that the blues are being enhanced and added to the shadow area. And the opposite happens. So if I go and reset this, and now if I bring it in here, it's taking away blues from the highlights. So it's basically like an inverse effect if you want to think of it that way. The reality is what's basically happening is you see these numbers here going 0 to 255. It's taking away the numbers in the blue channel and the highlights. So what's happening in essence is that the highlights are getting less blue. But what's really happening is that we're just adjusting the levels, or the amount of blue within the highlights, as it's not peaking to 255 anymore. So aside from those two things, let's go back into our color tab here. Now we have our color balance and we have our color editor. Under the advanced portion of the color editor, if we click on the color picker, and let's say we click on a foreground here, let's say view selected color range, you can see everything that we selected is saturated. If I uncheck view selected color range, you'll notice that everything is back to what it was. So let's go ahead and check that again. What this means is that it basically made a mask for us based on the color we've selected and the color surrounding that area. So that's a nice transition between the color we selected and neighboring colors. Once that's selected and that mask is visible, we'll turn this off really quick so you can see the whole image. Now what we'll basically do is, once we rotate this, you see that the color we've selected shifts So it adds more of a fantasy-like feel, and the leaves and the foliage is a lot more fantasy-like. Now, we can also add layers to this. So let's say we make another selection. We come over here to a color picker, we select the dress, and we do the same thing. You can see that the color of the dress also changes, and we've basically selected a mask and it harmonizes what we're trying to do. The saturation here impacts the saturation. The lightness impacts the luminosity. And the best part is because you're using the raw data, it allows you to extract information really naturally. And the basic tab here just selects a general range in case you decide that you would like to use the range that they've manually selected. And it does a pretty good job, as you can see. But I like the advanced tab because we're allowed to go even further. The skin tone tab itself is for another day, but in case you want to learn more about that, go to Phase 1's YouTube channel and it'll give you a full in-depth tutorial. Otherwise we'll spend another 15 minutes just going over that. But another tool that I want to show you in terms of color toning itself is under the Local Adjustment Brush tab. This allows you to basically add different color tones to different areas to get really creative if you so choose to. So let's say, for instance, we want to build on what we've done so far and take it to another level. A quick example would be changing the white balance to one specific area of an image to maybe create a warmer tone on the model and the subject. The first thing we'll do here as an example is we'll create a new layer and we'll call this white balance adjustment. Now that we've done that, I'm going to pick my arrow tool here for a moment, and before we get selected, I want you to know that in thinking of this as Photoshop terms, if you're used to doing in Photoshop, the mask on this layer is black by default. So any changes we make right now is not going to be visible until we start brushing on the mask itself. So for example, let's say we change our Kelvin and push it all the way to the left. Nothing is happening right now. But let's say we take this brush icon here. Now we'll click on this tab here, which is our settings tab. We can change our brush size. If you're on an English keyboard, you can use your bracket key, and that's a shortcut for that. I've kept my hardness at 0%, so it's nice and subtle. My opacity I'm keeping at 100. My flow I'll keep to something low like 5 or 6. And now what's going to happen is as I start brushing, you'll notice that the white balance of everywhere that I'm brushing gently starts coming in to the value that I have set. So I'm doing the inverse here. I'm actually going to change the white balance of the background, and I'll go ahead and change my hardness, or my brush size I should say, and just come around the model very gently and modify it that way. As you can see here, it's adding a really nice blend. If you feel like you've gone too far, you can simply click over here and use the eraser tool, which is a shortcut is provided here in case you don't want to do that. And then you can do the same thing by changing the settings. Once they've already set, you don't need to change them again, but the brush and the eraser have different settings, so keep that in mind. And then I would simply go ahead and brush over any area that I've gone too far in. So maybe I'll do a nice gentle transition. And once we've done that, it's going to brush right in. And I have my layer right here with my changes. In case you feel like you want to change the setting after you've brushed, you simply go in while your layer is selected and change the white balance. I have my option here is never display mask even while I'm drawing, but you can say always display mask, and what that does is in red it highlights where you brushed and where you haven't. But I do this only because I want to see the colors that are coming through, so I say never display mask. Also, even cooler is aside from doing one change to that mask, we can do multiple changes. So we can change the exposure of the area we brushed in case we want to do that, so we can darken the background while we change the color. And then we can add some contrast maybe, so we can add a nice like deep vignette. Let's change the white balance just a little bit. So you can see in just a quick few moments we're able to do quite a bit with our layer stack and our adjustments. There's also curves, so maybe we can make another layer and we can say curves. So as I mentioned before, by default we don't see the changes that are applied by moving this up and down because the mask itself is black in essence. So let's say we want to see the changes that we're doing and then erase it later. We can start by doing the inverse. We can right click on the layer itself. We can say invert mask. What this will allow us to do is by default any changes we make now will affect the entire layer, and we can do the inverse of it. So instead of drawing the mask, we're going to erase, and now when we erase, we're going to erase the areas that we don't want affected. So it's again just the inverse of it. So you can see I don't want the subject affected, and I'm just doing a gentle sweeping motion around the area, so maybe we can add a nice little vignette. So we'll go here, and the most amazing part is that we have it all on layers, so we can change them in case we don't want one or the other, and we can change it that way too. In terms of opacity, in case you've gone too far and you want to lower the opacity, all you really need to do is just adjust the intensity of the settings. We can also change again our color set here through our curves, through our channels, in case we want to come up with a different artistic approach to that as well. So we can do a whole host of different changes by using some of these tools. We also have the color editor here, so in case you don't like masking using just the color editor and you're having a hard time in specific areas, maybe you want just the bottom of the foliage here to change color, all you simply need to do is add another layer and name it color foliage maybe, and then you'd simply go into the advanced tab, click on the foliage, maybe change the saturation, we drop the hue rotation here. You can see the change we've done from before and after here. Now under local adjustments, we'll click on draw mask, and now that we mask it in, you can see what's happening to the foliage. So we're creating an interesting palette of tones just using the raw file in the Capture One stage. So let's see what our before looks like. We can right click on our thumbnail, and then instead of resetting this, we can go and click on new variant. What the new variant is it makes a copy of the raw file temporarily in its original state, so you can quickly see the before and after, which is really fascinating to see some of the changes we can make and compare the differences. Now, if we want to export this and go into Photoshop for further retouching, we can go ahead and right click, go to Export, Variant. You want to set the destination, I've set desktop. You can choose your own folder. You can set your format, which is just your image name. The next thing we want to know is format. We can say TIFF or PSD, whatever you prefer. Change the quality if we need to. Your color space, which sRGB or Adobe RGB. Then we have a resolution, which you can keep to 300 and 100%, and then you'd export one variant. Once you're done that, it'll pop up where you've located it in your destination folder, And from there, you can simply go ahead and modify this to your specific taste in case you need any other adjustment layers to bring this image home. Now, in terms of the retouching portion, in terms of pixel level retouching, there are some things that I do look for considerably. Number one is that the skin is as polished as possible. Now, because this is 100 megapixels and it was shot at 3200, there is some noise on the image, but considering this is medium format and at 3200, this is really impressive. The things that I do look for otherwise is things like sharpness of the details, maybe sharpening and adding some more details here to the props, maybe adding some highlights and adding some dodge and burn and more contouring in some of the skin, the hair, and just changing some of the distracting areas of the background in case you do see some areas, and basically using your creativity in bringing this image home. So I do look forward in seeing what everyone creates. I'm excited because this is an image that has a lot of depth and variation, and just because I've done it in one way doesn't mean that it's correct. And what I'm basically looking for is something really impressive visually. So, use color wheels, use references, use inspiration, and see what you can use. You can take this image and create with your own vision. So I look forward to it, and I can't wait to see what you create.